So the thing I'm going to try and address here in some way is the perception, and this is a difficult thing to be certain about or even to think about really, but the perception that the experience of the new millennium so far, in the West at least, has been one of profound transition, in which the political, cultural and economic forms that orient us in time and space seem to have become so weak or so attenuated that they're nearly not fit for purpose. And the things we were talking about this morning around the recession and whether the recession is part of a larger kind of economic shift, participatory culture, the possibility of revolution and how narratives fit with political change, all of these kinds of narrative do cluster around the experience of change, or the sense that we're in a place that we don't quite recognise. Certainly in the UK at the moment, one of the manifestations of this, more alarming for me than the UK riots of 2011 that we've already been talking about, is the appearance of Russell Brand as a political saviour, and what a Brand-style revolution would be. And this points to me to a profound sense of disorientation in relation to the kind of narratives within which we'd couch political radicalism. In many arenas, I think the feeling is incubating that we are entering into, or have already entered into, a period of historical change that is so foundational that it can't be properly registered by any of the instruments that we have to hand. The present time has echoes, I think, with that last period of profound economic change, the early 1970s, a time in which not only the economic base but also the superstructure, if we're still allowed to use those terms, went through a period of transformation, the effects of which we're still feeling. This, however, this sense of profound change is a very difficult feeling to process. Change itself is always hard to grasp or articulate, ontologically so. You never really experience the change. You're how you are, then you're different, but the change sort of tends to slip through the net or through your fingers. So change is always hard to grasp, but for us now the experience of transformation is perhaps particularly hard to capture, because the dominant cultural logic, at least since that economic crisis of 1973, has made change itself particularly resistant to thought or to critical articulation. One of the defining characteristics of the post-war period has been a sense of historical exhaustion, a sense of an ending that emerges both in Frank Comeau's 1967 work of criticism that many of us will have read, and in Julian Barnes' novel of 2011, a strange kind of rhyming, I think, that covers the period that I'm talking about. One of the effects of the postmodern revolution, if that's what it was, that occurred in the last decades of the 20th century, one of the symptoms of a perceived end of history, was a tendency to collapse the distinction between change and stasis, between sameness and difference. These oppositions, the same and the different, if you allow them to simply expand to their limits, these oppositions become what Frederick Jameson calls postmodern antinomies, which, and this is a quote from Jameson, effortlessly turn into one another at the slightest pretext, antitheses that turn out to be somehow the same. If we're very, very, very much the same, then we're kind of different, and if we're very, very different, we're kind of the same. There is a logic to this, believe me. Under these circumstances, where change and stasis have become so difficult to differentiate from one another, it's difficult to know how to gauge historical change, how to respond to a sense, as Muriel Spark puts it in her rather wonderful novel about the 73 crisis, that, how does she put it, that something is finished for always, something is changing totally. But the peculiar paradox of the contemporary era, a time that we've come to call sometimes late postmodernist, or that Laura will be talking about as post-postmodernist. This is something that's already come up, this particular phrasing. The peculiar paradox of this era is that while we no longer have a language in which to gauge or to couch a sense of historical change, let alone progress, that kind of Hegelian notion, we are nevertheless experiencing or suffering rapid and fundamental transformation. Despite the loss of faith in historical succession, that is perhaps the legacy of the postmodern period, it's the case that we find ourselves now in a new era, for which we have to invent a new terminology, and which requires us to imagine a different kind of future, a kind of futurity. With the turn of the millennium, with the partial replacement of material by digital environments, with the crisis in global capitalism, the waning of US power, the uncertain legacies of the 9/11 wars fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, the emergence of China and India as economic superpowers, the growing awareness of ecological crisis as the chief threat facing mankind, humankind, we live now in a transformed world, a world that is different to the one that gave rise to postmodernism as a cultural dominant. The awareness of this difference, of this fundamental change, and the perception that it will lead us to behold a future that is different from those imagined by postmodernism, if we can say that, is something that can be felt everywhere in the culture. So a difficulty facing us today is that the intuition of historical change is registered as the end of an era, the end of the period during which a postmodern sensibility became culturally dominant. But that very period depleted a sense of historical succession so drastically that we can't easily find a way of generating a critical response to the historical change that we nevertheless experience. And that combination might be at the very heart of the experience of the 2011 riots that we've already discussed. A kind of sense of profound dissatisfaction coupled with a complete inarticulacy about what it is that we should do to combat that experience. And in this context, the fear is that the end of postmodernism, if that is what we're experiencing, will not be historically progressive, will not reach forward to a new conception of the future, a new kind of democracy, but will lead us to move backwards, to resuscitate a whole series of historical languages and rhetorics that postmodern thinkers imagined that they'd put safely to death or to bed. For some commentators, this is why the possibility that the postmodern experiment has run out of steam is to be regretted as part of a more general cultural malaise. The waning of postmodernism, Frederick Jameson has argued, is one of what he calls the regressions of the current age, which presages what he calls the return to and re-establishment of all kinds of old things. The danger facing us for thinkers such as Jameson is that the new millennium will afford us an opportunity to simply restart the clocks, to return indeed to older conceptions of historical succession and liberal humanism that the postmodern moment had seemed so thoroughly to explode. Indeed, it's just this danger that Zadie Smith warns us against in her 2008 essay on the future of the novel that many of us will have read, entitled Two Directions for the Novel. This essay knowingly belongs to a long tradition of essays, many of them called The Future of the Novel. There's about 50 of them. This long tradition of essays, such as Henry James's essay called The Future of the Novel, Alain Robbe-Grier's essay called A Future for the Novel. They're not very imaginative, these titles. Smith's essay belongs to this tradition. And like those earlier essays, Smith suggests that the world that we find ourselves in now heralds dark days for the novel form. It's of course the case that the novel is always about to die, and all of these reflections on the future of the novel are about how it's dead in its current form and we need somehow to reinvent it. These are not healthy times for the novel, Smith writes in 2008, because the experimental energy that had been imparted to the novel first by postmodernism and then first by modernism and then by postmodernism has melted away, abandoning us to a resurgent realism, a banal kind of prettified prose that she calls lyrical realism. While Henry James' essay on the future of the novel anticipated the eruptions of Joycean modernism in its call to some great artist yet to come, and while Robbe-Grier's essay predicted the coming of a transformative postmodernism which would finally rid us of the realistic illusions of a Balzac or a Madame de Lafayette, Zadie Smith suggests that these revolutions have failed, like the autumning of the Arab Spring. Robbe-Grier writes in 1956 that the only conception of the novel to have currency today is in fact that of Balzac. That's Robbe-Grier in 56. And Smith, more than 50 years later in 2008, suggests that this is still depressingly the case, that after the radicalisms of Joyce and Beckett and Pynchon have run their course, and this is a quote from Smith, the last man standing is the Balzac-Flaubert model, she writes. Critiques of this model of realism, Smith suggests, which began with Robbe-Grier in 56, peaked in a late century moment characterised by what she calls radical deconstructive doubt that questions the capacity of language itself to describe the world with any accuracy. But now, with the regressions of our current age, the publishing and creative industries, Smith argues, have fallen back on a tried and tested formula. The American metafiction, she writes, that stood in opposition to realism, that of Barth, Bartlemy, Pynchon, Gaddis, David Foster Wallace, who we're about to hear about, has been relegated, Smith writes, to a safe corner of literary history to be studied in post-modernity modules and dismissed by our most prominent public critics as a fascinating failure. Opposing the lyrical realism of Joseph O'Neill's novel Netherland. Have people here read Netherland? It's not quite as bad as Smith makes it out to be. Opposing the lyrical realism of this novel by Joseph O'Neill, Netherland, to the avant-gardism of Tom McCarthy's novel Remainder, which I do recommend if you haven't read it, Smith suggests that the contemporary marketplace has sidelined the latter, experimentalism, to give the former a kind of a lyrical realism, the freedom of the road. The literary economy, she writes, sets up its stall on that road that leads to Netherland, along which one might wave to Jane Austen, George Eliot, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Richard Yates, Saul Bellow. Rarely has it been less aware or less interested in seeing what's new on the route to Remainder, that skewed side road where we meet Georges Perec, Clarice Lispector, Maurice Blanchot, William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard. Unquote. Smith's scepticism about the capacity of the contemporary environment to gestate an inventive future for the novel is understandable and corresponds, of course, to the tradition of critical reflections on the future to which her essay knowingly belongs. And also you can feel the sort of the texture of that essay in our discussions today. You know, do we take from Diane's essay, do we feel these transformations in the culture that we can grasp? Are these reactionary kind of turning back or simply reheating old forms of rhetoric, or is there a way of seeing something new in the culture that's about to emerge? But as she herself acknowledges, Smith herself acknowledges, the passing of the postmodern moment presages both the end of a certain strain of experimental thinking and the hesitant opening of a set of new possibilities. The chance is there now in the future we behold that the novel might shake itself out of its present complacency, as she puts it, just as Henry James and Rob Grier before her saw the novel as an antidote to its own failures. McCarthy's Remainder is an example of that kind of art that Rob Grier foresees, that kind of what he calls a stuttering monster that in its very monstrosity marks both the death of the novel and the rebirth of a new and unreadable form. If anyone's read McCarthy's Remainder, they'll know what we mean by that there is something phenomenally resistant to reading going on in the mode of experimentation that McCarthy adopts. McCarthy's novel, obviously for Smith a descendant of Rob Grier's jealousy, might appear to come to literature as an assassin to kill the novel stone dead, but rather, Smith says, it serves instead as a purgative, or what Derrida calls a pharmacon. It clears away a little of the dead wood, offering a glimpse of an alternative road, Smith writes, down which the novel might with difficulty travel forward. McCarthy's novel for Smith is an example of what she calls creative deconstruction, and it's this quality, this winning of creative rebirth from a dismantlement of the old order and of the old novel that offers what she calls, what Smith calls, a true future for the novel. So it's easy to see, I think, why Smith regards McCarthy as offering this combination of poison and remedy, and why she sees the futures of the novel as requiring this kind of suicidal renaissance. McCarthy belongs, one might suggest, to a new generation of British writers who are emerging in the wake of the 70s generation, that generation that included Amis and McEwan and all of the others. A generation, this new generation, which includes writers with whom McCarthy himself might feel very little affiliation. In the UK scene, these are writers such as Ali Smith, Nicola Barker, David Mitchell, and of course Zadie Smith herself. There is much divergence in this group, not least in the traditions that they espouse, and in the balance their work strikes in the supposed opposition between the realist and the experimental. But one thing that they perhaps share is the imperative that they respond to historical change without simply resuscitating a set of chronological and historiographical models that expired somewhere in the middle of the last century. These writers must respond to the novelty of their time, of our time maybe, to reach from past to future. They must open themselves up to an unknown future whilst also responding to the possibility that novelistic narrative forms that we have available to us are themselves estranged or peculiar. If this generation is seeking to inherit the legacy left by the pioneers of the last century, then it can't do so by simply returning to those forms of patrilineage, of succession and inheritance that constitute the temporal medium of what Smith calls the Balzac-Flaubert model of prose realism, a term that myself I rather dislike. As Nicola Barker discovers in Darkmans, as Ali Smith discovers in her novel The Accidental, as David Mitchell discovers in the looping genealogies of his novel Cloud Atlas, and now The Bone Clocks, which I'm just reading at the moment, the new novel requires us to invent a new time sense, a new way of articulating and measuring the slowed, speeded, uncanny being in time that runs throughout McCarthy's novel Remainder. Indeed, and to come to the second part of this talk, perhaps one of the most striking recent attempts to time the novel, to tune it to this new wavelength, and in so doing, in Smith's phrase, to push narrative realism a little harder, is Smith's own 2013 novel, NW. It's that, as in the postal district, NW. This novel announces from the beginning its fascination with the measuring of oddly moving time, a time that moves in a peculiar way. We only have to look at the novel's punchy opening line to see this. The novel opens with the line, "The fat sun stalls by the phone masts." I'll say that again, "The fat sun stalls by the phone masts." I think it's a very lovely opening line. Zadie Smith's best line, I think. This is a cultured opening, if we can use that phrase as well, which calls to a number of ghosts, not least of which is Beckett's 1938 novel Murphy, which opens with the wonderful declaration that, and many of us will know it, you can chant it, the sun shone, having no alternative on the nothing new. The sun shone, having no alternative on the nothing new. As in Beckett's opening, the stalled sun that shines in the opening line of NW suggests the failure of historical progression. If the rising of the sun is the classic sign of investment in the future, I'm tempted to sing Orphan Annie's "The Sun Will Come Up Tomorrow," but I'll spare you that treat. In fact, now I've got it in my head, I can't find my play. If the rising of the sun is the sign of investment in the future, then Beckett's and Smith's suns are the mark of the unavailability of the future, the collapse of linear chronology. The unmoving fat sun in Smith is suggestive of a kind of permanent sunset, a kind of universal bloated late historical gloaming that recalls the fattened and dying sun that hangs over H.G. Wells' late historical nightmare in The Time Machine. Or indeed the yawningly extended postmodern sunsets that punctuate the aimless passage of time in Don DeLillo's novel White Noise. Smith's sun, however, is stalled by the phone masts, which gives a kind of odd historical specificity to this picture of the end of history. There's a pairing or a kind of adjacency that this opening puts in motion, a kind of association between the stalling of time and the emergence of mobile phone technology. Even here in this condensed line, one can feel the breath of a contradiction or a kind of historical dialectic. The stalled sun suggests the failure of history, Beckett's nothing new, but as it comes to rest among the phone masts, in its sort of fat way, it's associated with perhaps the defining mark of our hypermodernity, the engine of contemporary novelty and rapid technological transformation that we see in the mobile phone. As the novel unfolds from this first sentence, this tension between historical exhaustion and the experience of a kind of imminent futurity, between stasis and transformation, between a time that's slowed and stalling and one that's accelerating at breakneck speed, becomes a recurrent preoccupation. There's an acute awareness throughout the narrative of the apparent winding down at the turn of the century of historical forces and the resulting failure of the mechanisms by which we might recognise change, or propel ourselves into an unmade future. A character named Felix, on the day that he was murdered on a London street, this is one of the central events of NW without wanting to ruin it for anyone, on the day that he's murdered on a London street, thinks to himself that, quote, it had always been obvious that the future would suit him. Hollywood had nothing on Felix, he thinks to himself, when it comes to imagining the future. This, of course, on the day that he died. Felix's murder by petty criminals after a squabble on the tube is in some sense a denial of that capacity to imagine the future at what the novel calls in the heading of one of its short sections, the end of history. The sun continues to set as the novel continues to pass, as if to mark this slow dwindling of futurity. The sunsets, as one of the characters observes, are getting longer and longer, and the passage of the narrative itself is shaped by recurring images of a growing, bloating, fattening, setting sun. The mighty sun, huge and orange in the sky. But in the midst of this grand historical decline, the novel traces the uncertain stirrings of a new kind of persistence, a new way in which time extends itself, just as the old forms of chronology lose their narrative power. The novel seeks to tune itself to what it calls an, quote, internal time stretched and stilled, inattentive to the minutes and hours outside itself, a time that speeds and slows according to a logic that is only now unfolding. And as its opening line suggests, the novel finds that it's in part technology that determines and conditions this new time. The novel's fascination with stretched and stilled internal time, with the possibility that time slows down and that time speeds up, is always related to the time and the space of the internet and of the smartphone. Though incredibly fast, a character called Natalie Blake thinks, though incredibly fast, her phone was still too slow. I think we all know that feeling. The technology that's dematerialised the culture has produced a new way of experiencing the passing moment, a newness that is so new that it disables our capacity to think about it as newness. As the cultural logic of postmodernism made it difficult for us to grasp the possibility of historical change, so in Smith's novel we find that the very novelty of contemporary time eludes our capacity to grasp it as novelty, to separate out the new from the old. At some point, Natalie thinks, in a section entitled Speed, at some point we became aware of being modern, of changing fast, of coming after just now. John Donne was also a modern and surely saw change, but we feel that we are more modern and that change is faster. Even the immutable is faster. Communications technology, Smith's narrator suggests, has made the changeless itself somehow fissile, unstable and mercurial. Our experience of modernity, of coming after just now, has led us to a point where we can't orientate ourselves in passing time, can't find an unmoving point from which we might take our bearings and distinguish new from old, the mutable from the immutable. So if NW is an attempt to forge a new future for the novel after the passing of postmodernism, if that is the case, then it's this attentiveness to the fitful passage of contemporary time that underlies such an attempt. If, as Smith herself has recently suggested, the novel is an exercise in style, NW is an exercise in style, then its experiments with shifting voice, with multiple points of view, with fractured micro-narratives, are organised around an attempt to catch at the way that strangely passing time modulates a contemporary reality, determining the texture of what she calls the thinginess of the real. The novel is concerned at its heart, like Smith's earlier novels White Teeth and On Beauty, with the passing of generations and with the forms of hybridity and cosmopolitanism with which such passing from one generation to the next brings. The two central characters, Leah Hanwell and Natalie Blake, are 30-ish women finding themselves caught at the fulcrum point in such a historical passage, looking backwards to their upbringing in an ethnically diverse northwest London and forwards to their own roles as mothers in giving rise to a new generation in London. The novel sets out to explore the panic that this metamorphosis from child to parent induces, and in doing so offers itself in part as a generic post-colonial coming-of-age story. Leah Hanwell yields to the pressure to conceive a child with her African-French husband Michel, but undergoes a secret abortion when she becomes pregnant, as she finds herself resisting the historical role of bridge between the last generation and the next. In depicting the historical progress towards cultural diversity, towards the making of a cosmopolitan London, the novel dwells on the peculiar sense that taking up such a role in a kind of teleological history involves the evacuation of one's own life, the loss of that right in the novel's recurrent refrain to be, quote, the sole author of one's being. And maybe all of us with children will recognise that loss and gain. Imagining the spectacle of herself standing by her elderly mother's side, Lear thinks that this adjacency of youth and age might look like a historical principle. Like human perfectibility, each generation improves on the last, fitter, healthier, more productive. Her refusal to become herself a mother, when she has this secret visit to an abortion clinic, is in a sense the denial of this model of historical becoming, in favour of an immersion in self. In setting herself against the flow of time, she thinks she has, quote, forced a stillness in herself, has burrowed into a midlife moment that she doesn't want to allow to pass, a static moment in which time will stop, and she thinks to herself, I'll never die. Now, in dramatising this kind of anxiety experienced both by Lear and by Natasha, NW is, as I have said, might be read in some ways as a generic tale of transgenerational becoming, along the lines of White Teeth or On Beauty or Andrea Levy's novel Small Island. But what sets NW apart from these earlier works is the quality of its attention to the fine historical mechanics of this becoming, and the ways in which the historical conditions it examines meet with the texture of Smith's own emerging model of realism. Lear's existential panic in the face of parenthood is finely interwoven with the novel's interest in the passage of time, so the novel's thematic concern with the turning of generations becomes one with its search for a narrative form that can catch the speeding, slowing movement of contemporary time. The problem, Lear thinks to herself as she puzzles on her resistance to motherhood, seems to be two conceptions of time. I want, she thinks to herself, to stay still and keep moving. She wants to find herself authored both in the brightly lit present, in the static moment of pure selfhood, and in the story of herself as a player in a larger history, one which leads from her mother's generation to that of her unborn child. And in seesawing between these two desires, she lives out the tension between still and moving time that permeates the language of the novel, and it becomes a kind of motivating principle that can be seen in miniature in the contradiction contained in that opening first line, the fat son stalling by the phone mast. And it's this tension, this opposition between movement and stasis as the basis of our being in time that permeates, sorry, I lost my place, that fuels the novel's realism. The novel's title, NW, announces that this is a regional novel of a sort, a novel obsessively concerned with a specific geographical location in the northwest of London. Almost every response to the novel on its publication dwelt on the particularity of this representation of a specific locale. The clarity of Smith's description of the area crossed by the 37 and 98 buses, her attentiveness to local colour, to the slightest modulations in accent and dialect, to the play of light on London architecture, places this novel in a long tradition of London novels and an equally long tradition of regional realism. It suggests, as John Mellon has recently put it, that, quote, location is reality. But what's most striking about this super-real representation of London is that it's inhabited at every moment by the historical dynamics I've been describing. The realism with which the city itself is depicted never exhibits the plastic deadness that Smith associates with contemporary lyrical realism, because the city is fed always by a kind of historical cross-current. The picture that the novel offers of what the narrator calls the unruly England of real life is one that's in constant movement as the surfaces of which the novel is made undulate and ripple around the historical tides that move beneath them. The unruly England that Smith presents us with is a nation of the old church, of the new, and of a time before churches, as she puts it. There is no eternal life here, but only a set of conflicting ancient and modern histories, histories of different nations and peoples, as well as histories that move at different speeds and are powered by different material forces. As Smith focuses on the passage of ethnically diverse generations, as she depicts the struggle of her two central characters to negotiate the historical forces that are contained in their experience of adulthood and parenthood, she works to create a narrative form that can give a kind of expression to these conflicting forces and principles that course through a corner of cosmopolitan London in the first decade of the 21st century. Indeed, and I'm coming to a conclusion now, the title of the novel itself has a double meaning, or at least a double meaning, which draws attention to this cleft in the work between a regional realism and a historical realism. NW refers not only to the London postal district, but to a series of other clustered associations. It insistently suggests throughout the new, of course, there's only a missing E, the absence of which Beckett's son is required to illuminate at the beginning of Murphy. But it also refers to the designation nowhere throughout, which recurs across the novel and which always brings with it a kind of temporal force. The uncannily vivid and embodied pictures of northwest London, which make up this novel, are always shadowed by this other NW, this nowhere place, which is of course also the etymology of utopia, no place, which is the spatial manifestation of the unlived future here, of the new, the utopian, that abstraction to which the death-bound Felix feels himself peculiarly suited. As Natalie and Leah struggle to accommodate the demand that they place their lives within a set of mutually antagonistic historical and narrative frames, the historical principle which drives the novel, perhaps most forcefully, is not any of the national or familial histories to which they belong, but this nowhere place, this empty, utopian no place that beckons them forward. Often enough, the novel's nowhere is a deathly and unpleasant place, as deathly as it is for Felix, and it's often not easy to see its utopian potential. As Leah waits to be anaesthetised in an abortion clinic, to be delivered into the fascinatingly annihilated non-time of anaesthetised unconsciousness, the novel just gives us 10, 9, 8, oblivion, which all of us who have had a general anaesthetic will recognise. She thinks to herself as she's waiting to be anaesthetised that this is a strange place, the abortion clinic, a no place. Again, the etymology, troublingly here, of utopia. The denial of the future that the abortion implies is one of the manifestations of nowhere in this novel. And as the novel draws to a close, this correspondence between nowhere, death, and the denial of generational history re-emerges. Natalie leaves her home, her family home, towards the end of the novel after a row with her husband, declaring when asked where the fuck she thought she was going, that she was heading nowhere. I'm going nowhere. The aimless strolling to nowhere, as she then describes her walk, takes her by some strange compulsion to Hornsley Lane, which she describes as the middle of nowhere, and to the Archway Bridge, the bridge which has been chosen since it was built by the suicidal, or what the novel calls people going nowhere. Natalie stands on the edge of the bridge and contemplates this annihilation, like that experienced by Leah under anaesthetic, the annihilation which makes of the bridge not a passage between generations, or between moments indeed, but a bottomless void. But if the novel is organised in a sense around this correspondence between nowhere and death, checking out, it's also the case that this emptiness at the heart of the geographies and histories that the novel depicts is the driving principle of the novel, the constructive force which might offer what Smith calls an alternative road down which the novel might with difficulty travel forward. The histories of which this novel is composed, the combination of new time and old time, speeded and slowed time, last generation and next, gather around this nowhere at the heart of the novel, a nowhere that comes to us as a kind of death, certainly, but also as the promise of uncolonised and unlived time, the time in which anything might happen and in which we might become anyone we choose. If there is to be a utopian future for the novel, if in NW's terms the no places with which the landscape is pitted might turn out to be good places, which is the other etymology, of course, of utopia, it's a good place and a no place, then it's only by tuning its realism to the pitch of this withheld futurity, only by carrying the movement of unstoried time within its own sentences, that the novel might build a bridge towards it. If we are to realise something like Smith's constructive deconstruction in the aftermath to the last century and after the waning of the postmodern period, then we must orient ourselves to this utopian no place that's also a suicide bridge or a bridge to nowhere. Thank you.